Welcome to the Reconnection Club podcast, the show that helps parents heal troubled relationships with their adult sons and daughters. I'm your host, psychotherapist Tina Gilbertson. Each week, I'll offer you compassion, clarity, and personal development tips designed to help you reconnect, not only with your child, but with yourself. Now let's get started. Many parents I speak with have emotional injuries or even trauma that predated their adult children's estrangement. And I think the reason unwanted estrangement is so excruciating for parents is, in addition to the pain you would expect from a disruption in the parent-child relationship, estrangement taps into any and all related emotional distress in your personal history. The loneliness of neglect in childhood, for example. The anguish of feeling unwanted, rejected, or abandoned. The shame of continued criticism or ridicule. And the powerlessness and resentment so often learned from physical and psychological abuse. If you survived relational injuries early on, and most of us did, one way or the other to some degree, you probably developed skills to cope with the emotional echoes of those experiences. Being able to cope and having coping skills is needed for survival, and coping is part of the journey of healing. But coping is not the same as healing, and I want to talk about that today because I meet with people who've had even years of therapy, and good therapy, and they have great coping skills, but they also carry substantial emotional pain from old wounds that never fully healed. And when I say fully healed, I don't mean there isn't a scar, or that the person is exactly the same as they were before. I don't believe that's necessarily possible. But I do believe in a kind of full enough emotional healing that restores the ability to self-soothe under duress and access the brain's executive functions to solve relational problems. Until a certain stage of healing is attained, we tend to view the present through a distorting lens of past hurts, especially under stress. And estrangement is nothing if not stressful. Any emotional injuries that haven't fully healed will add their weight to a parent's experience of their adult child's estrangement. I talk about how feelings do this and how to help them resolve in my first book, Constructive Wallowing. And I also touched on how past hurts affect the present in episodes 125 and 126. I'll link to those in the show notes. So with the proviso that healing can be a lifelong process that isn't perfect and does leave marks, here are some of the differences I perceive between healing and coping. I'm sure there are more, but I'll highlight 5. First, healing always means changing. We cannot heal without changing because healing is defined as a particular process of change. From, say, an open wound to a healing wound that's still tender, to a scar that becomes more sturdy and changes color over time. Coping might involve change, but it doesn't have to. It's not baked in with coping. We can use alcohol to cope with anxiety, for example, or emotional eating to cope with grief until the day we die. Although coping methods or frequency might change over time, there is no necessary evolution of coping. Number 2, emotional healing happens in relationship, while coping can happen anywhere. Because emotional injuries occur in relationships with others, we need others as we heal. For instance, the only way to undo conditioning that says we're not good enough is to repeatedly feel good enough to someone without doing what we normally do to be good enough. If we want to heal the injuries that lead to what's called people-pleasing, we have to be able to drop those people-pleasing behaviors and find out if we are, in fact, good enough without them. We can't do that experiment outside of relationship. We need people to try not pleasing and see what happens. It's in surviving those relational trials over time that we begin to heal. In contrast, coping can be done in isolation. In fact, isolation itself can be used as a coping mechanism. And certainly, some of the destructive forms of coping, like substance abuse, are often done alone. Third, healing happens in an environment that's perceived as safe enough, such as in a secure home with a caring, stable relationship and predictable access to food and material resources. Coping, on the other hand, is prioritized when the environment is perceived as dangerous. The danger may be as salient as a physical threat or as subtle as a lack of trust. In a nutshell, safety begets healing, and danger tends to produce coping. Fourth, the gains from healing are permanent. A recently broken leg requires a cast and crutches for a while, but not forever. Once it reaches a certain point, healing creates a large-scale, permanent change. The gains from coping, on the other hand, are temporary by design. We have to continually cope in order to cope. Until we experience a consistent level of material and psychological safety sufficient for healing, coping will naturally take its place. And as long as coping is taking the place of healing, it will always be required. Lastly, healing almost always involves a period of coping, but not the other way around. Coping is a necessary part of healing. We cope with a broken bone as best we can with the tools we have while it heals. But healing isn't automatically invoked by coping. Just because we cope with a noisy neighbor doesn't mean the situation is improving. Things might evolve in a good direction if the neighbor moves away or spontaneously makes less noise, but coping with noise doesn't mean the noise will subside. Coping and healing can both be thought of as biological imperatives, meaning the body will always try to do both as needed. So both healing and coping are undoubtedly valid and valuable. Let me review those points of difference, though, before I close. First, healing is a form of change. Coping doesn't require change. Second, emotional healing takes place in relationships, while coping can happen in isolation. Third, healing is associated with safety and coping with danger. Fourth, healing's advances are permanent. Coping provides relief only as long as we do it. And fifth, healing usually requires coping in the early stages, but coping doesn't necessitate healing, and therefore may be endless. Although both the process of healing and the practice of coping are natural, necessary, and valuable, beware of mistaking good coping for active healing. Until next time, remember that you are a loving, lovable, and still growing human being. So please take good care of yourself. Bye for now. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Reconnection Club podcast, I invite you to check out reconnectionclub.com. The Reconnection Club is for parents at any stage of estrangement from their adult, child, or children. So whether you've just realized there's trouble between you, you've been living with estrangement for years, or you're newly reconciled but still walking on eggshells, the Reconnection Club is your essential resource for information, support, and continued personal growth. With our courses and workshops, expert interviews, monthly Q&A calls, and a friendly, active community, the Reconnection Club is a wonderful place to be for anyone suffering the pain of estrangement from an adult, child, or children. So check it out at reconnectionclub.com.